All right, so both say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av, Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of Sora and Sara this month in honor of Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson, who enable all of those outside of the physical Bais Midrash to participate in our shiurim. To thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all of Sora and Sara this month in memory of Sergeant Nicholai Rappaport of the Givati Brigade, who died in a Hezbullah ambush in southern Lebanon in February of 1998. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Lara Franks and the zechus of refuah sheleima for Chaya Mira Sora and Sara Elisheva, and to thank our week of learning sponsors, Yanky Aliza Statman and the zechus of refuah sheleima for Chaya Rivka Nechama. Also, we also take the opportunity to dedicate our learning in the zechus of refuah sheleima for our Chaver in Shir, Dr. Ron Gartenhouse, who was dealing with some significant health issues, is currently hospitalized in University of Maryland, and Baruch Hashem is doing better, but needs our tfilos. So we dedicate our learning in the zechus of Ruvain Baruch ben Esther, and we hope that in Meretz Hashem he has a complete and enduring refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. With that, let us begin. We have a very exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Ayin Tes 79, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Ches on the base 87b. Second. Okay. Good. Fine. Ayin Ches on the base. We left off again 78. Sorry, I said 80, right? Good. 78b. 78b. So we're picking up. We actually left off Hachamayaskinon, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 11 lines up from the bottom. So just very quickly, if you remember again, the last part of the daf that we were doing in yesterday's daf was the concept of, the Mishnah introduced us to the concept of karov lo, mechza al mechza. So it started out with a get, right? And the concept ultimately, again, Ruvain is divorcing Rachel, takes a get, throws the get to Rachel. So remember again, the Mishnah said, if it's closer to her, she's divorced. If it's closer to him, they're not divorced. Mechza al mechza, kind of like in the middle. Safek migurashes. Again, it's a situation of a safek. So remember again, we saw the Mishnah seemed to indicate that the same halacha applies to Kiddushin, and the same halacha also applies to the repayment of a debt. The Gemara then quoted a Brisa. The Gemara actually quoted Rabbi Asin and Rabbi Yochanan that it only applies to Gittin, but doesn't apply to anything else. So we're trying now to reconcile this statement of Rabbi Yossi that karov lo, mechza only applies to Gittin, doesn't apply to anything else. How do we reconcile that with our Mishnah? So to reconcile it with Kiddushin, that's not such a big deal, because remember again, Gittin and Kiddushin are two sides of the same coin. Sounds strange to say, but still it is. And therefore, whatever applies to Gittin is going to apply to Kiddushin. What about Balchov? How could it apply to a debt? So the Gemara Sachamaya Skinon, what's the case here? The Amarle Zrokli Chovi Viti Pater. We'll say the case is where the lender is telling the borrower, just throw me the money, and you'll satisfy your obligation. If that's the case, okay, if that's what the lender is saying, then what is there to say? Well, he's saying, the lender is saying to the borrower, throw me what you owe me in accordance with the laws of Gittin. So the Gemara says, that's fine. So in other words, if that's what he's saying, that's what he's saying. What would you have thought? You might have thought that maybe the lender could say to the borrower, I was just kidding around with you. Right? I was just kidding around with you. I didn't actually want you to go ahead and repay me this way. It was a joke. Kamash Mala, no. Kamash Mala will say that if the lender says to the borrower, essentially, go ahead and repay me in accordance with the halachos of Gittin, namely, throw me the money, throw me the repayment. If it's closer to me, I'm repaid. If it's closer to you, I'm not repaid. Mechza. Again, yachloku, we split it. So if he says that, then einachinami, it works. Good. Amr Chista. Get biado, Mashiach biado. That's an interesting case over here. Chis says, imagine the following situation. Reuven gives Rachel a get. The get has a string tied to it. So Reuven's holding the get. Rachel's holding the get. Reuven's holding the string. So I'll say, what's talacha? If Reuven has a strong enough hold that if he yanks the string, the get will come back to him, then ultimately she's not divorced, right? Which makes sense. What's the logic there? Since ultimately, again, he retains the ability to pull back the get, therefore, halacha l'maaseh, it's not really a divorce. Ve'im lav migurashas, but ultimately, again, if not, in other words, even though he's holding the string, but if he doesn't have enough strength to be able to pull the get back, then ultimately, again, she is divorced. Okay, so what's the reason? My time about krisos v'laka. We'll say the whole chap of a get, right? The Torah refers to a get as a sefer krisos, a book of division. The whole concept of a get is that it is something that dissolves a marriage. So we'll say, so therefore, halacha l'maaseh, if he could pull it back, then ultimately, again, it's not a sefer krisos. Good. So, Amar Yehuda, Haisiyada asui keketafrus v'zarkula afa pishe get liada ena migrashes. What's another interesting case? Imagine for a moment, Reuven is divorcing Rachel, and Rachel's holding out her hands, but she's holding her hands out sloped downwards. So therefore, what's going to happen when Reuven puts the get in her hands? I will say, what's going to occur? Gravity is going to occur. The get is simply going to roll off her hands. So the Gemara says, she's not divorced. So amai, I don't understand. Now, say, now bipashtos, why isn't she divorced? The Gemara seems to feel that there's a lack of receptivity on her part, right? In other words, she's not receiving the get, since it's hitting her hand and rolling right off. But the Gemara says, I don't think even if it rolls off, amai, haki kanafal ba'arba amos dida kanafal. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? Even if the get rolls off, let's say, where is the get rolling off to? Where's it rolling off to? Her dalaramas. It should be fine. Bidelo nach. The Gemara says it's talking about a case where the get doesn't come to rest. For example, Rashi points out over here, imagine for a moment to say that it rolls off her hand and it blows into a nearby fire. Okay, so it never comes to rest in her dalar amis. So 1 second. She should be divorced by dint of the fact that the get falls into the airspace. Remember, I will say, not only does Dalar Amas acquire, on the actual land of Dalar Amas, but there's airspace of Dalar Amas that should acquire as well. Tivshot to Bay Rebbe Lazar, Arba Amos Amri Yeshlan Aver, only an Aver. Tivshot to Inlan Aver. So we'll say, this happens in Machlokes. This is a discussion. Do Dalar Amas have airspace or not? So apparently, based on this, you'd have to say, Dalar Amas don't have airspace. To which the Gemara says, no. What's the case here? Ba'omedas al-gav hanar to make kara li'ibud koi. So we'll say this is very interesting. What's the case? The case over here is she is standing by the banks of the river. So I will say, what does this mean? That when that get rolls out of her hands, essentially, it's never coming to rest. Right? It's never coming to rest. Even if you hold that Dalet Amis has avir, has airspace, that's only the type of Dalet Amis in which something is capable of coming to rest on the ground. But if something is not capable of coming to rest on the ground, everyone will agree that type of Dalet Amis has no avir. So we'll say, essentially, we're talking about a case where Ruvain is putting a get into Rachel's hands. Rachel has her hands slanted down. She's standing by the bank of the river. The Gemara says this is a case, she is not nigureshes. Why? Because she's not properly receiving it in her hand, and her Dalet Amis can't go ahead and receive it either. Why? Because her Dalet Amis are by the river. The object really never has the ability to come fully to rest, so therefore she's not going to go ahead and acquire it on the ground of the Dalet Amis. And if something can't come to rest on the ground of the Dalet Amis, then what? It doesn't have avir, it doesn't have space as well. Bottom line, don't do it. Good. So with that, Mishnah, top of Ayin Tes, 79a. Let's say an incredible case over here. She's standing on a rooftop. She's standing on the rooftop. Haisomedes al rosh hagag. Let's say, by the way, it's so beautiful to read this Mishnah also during these days. Remember again, we have the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, and then ultimately again the weeks in between Tisha B'Av going into Rosh Hashanah. We have Shiva de Nechemta. We have the weeks of consolation. So I'll say the Lasson of this Mishnah, Haisa Omedes al Rosh Hagag, is reminiscent of the words of the Medrash that say, Bisha Shemelach HaMashiach Ba, when Mashiach comes, what's going to happen? Omed al Gag Beis HaMikdash. He will stand on the rooftop of the Beis HaMikdash, and from there he will cry out to Klal Yisrael, the Geula has come. So he's going to be Omed al Gag. A little bit of a different context. Haisa Omedes al Rosh Hagag. Let's say ultimately again, Rachel is standing on the rooftop. Vizarkula, and he throws her a get. Right. So the Pashtus Reuben is standing on the ground. She's standing on the rooftop. He throws her a get. Once the get reaches the airspace of the rooftop, ultimately again she is migaresh. So what I say, the idea over here is the get doesn't have to come to rest on the rooftop itself in order for her to be divorced. Once the get arrives in the airspace of the rooftop, she is divorced. That's case one. Case two. Humi lamala v'himi lamata. We'll say what happens if he's on the rooftop and she's, let's say, below. We'll call it in the courtyard. So v'zarkula, he throws her the get from the rooftop below. Kevan shetzem rishos agag. So we'll say once the get leaves the domain of the roof. So even if nimchak of nisraf, even if the get is erased or the get is burned, harizim migreshes, she is divorced. Okay, so I have to define the parameters of that case. The Gemara says, I v'halo mintar. So we'll say, so now let's look at the first case. Let's look at the first case, right? So remember again, she's standing on the rooftop, he's standing below, he throws her the get. So the Mishnah says, ultimately again, once it gets into the airspace of the rooftop, then halacha l'maisa, she is divorced. The Gemara says, but the rooftop itself is not guarded. In other words, they're both saying, how could the airspace of the rooftop acquire for her when the airspace itself is not guarded? Take a look at Rashi. V'halo mintar, avir hagag do'asi zeka v'shadile mikame delinach, kilo shaja zeka v'ira lo davar ahar sheba kela v'kalto gsham. So as I say, the idea over here is that halacha l'maisa, in order for avir, and this is the piggyback of the previous sugya, in order for airspace to acquire, it has to be the kind of airspace of area where the item can ultimately come to rest. The concern over here is you're talking about just a rooftop. So once that get gets into the airspace of the rooftop, there is no guarantee that that get is coming to rest. After all, again, a wind could just blow it off. To which the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Shmuel, Begag sheyesh l'mayka askina. What are we talking about? Or a fenced-in rooftop. A fenced-in rooftop. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, this is a secure area. The get is going to come to rest. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, she's divorced. Ula bar Menashe Mishnei Davimi Amar Hacha bepachos mishlosha samach l'gag askinon tichol pachos mishlosha samach l'gag gegag dami. What's the second answer? Second answer. It's been a while since we've seen this. What's the second answer? Loved. We'll say, what does loved say? Loved says that anything that is within 3 tefachim of the ground is considered attached to the ground. Considered attached to the ground. So therefore, halacha l'maisa. The Gemara gives one of two answers. Either we're talking about a fenced-in rooftop, or we're talking about loved. Fine. Humi lamala. What's the case number 2 in the Mishnah was? He's standing on the rooftop. She's standing in the courtyard below. So what's the halacha? The Mishnah said, once the get leaves the reshus of the gag, the reshus of the roof, ultimately she's divorced. I have a halo mintar, but same thing I will say. Same thing. In other words, I don't understand. Even once it leaves the reshus of the gag, why is she divorced? It's in an unguarded area. So Rabbi say this is interesting. What's the case? The case is where the courtyard walls actually go higher than the rooftop. So it's like you can imagine you have a home. He's standing on the roof of the home. The home itself is surrounded by walls. Imagine for a moment that the exterior walls of the home compound are actually taller than the roof. So therefore, I'll say something very interesting is happening over here. Picture good. So I'll say, so now what happens? When he throws the get and the get leaves the rooftop, where is the get situated? Within the exterior walls. So that's the case ultimately again, where once it leaves the domain of the rooftop, ultimately she is divorced. So talking about a case where the exterior walls are taller than the interior walls, the rooftop walls. Okay, so we'll say, whose opinion does this reflect? This reflects the view of Rebbe, Damar Kluta Kimisha hun chadami. I will say, Rebbe is of the opinion that this is actually very interesting. Kluta Kimisha kishun means something that goes through the airspace is as if it has come to rest. Take a look at Rashi. Kluta besocha avir Kimisha hun chala ares. Asanya azorek b'sham b'shasarabim b'shasarabim u'rishas yochad ve'emsa Rebbe mechai v'cham pocher. And I will say, remember this case from Masechah Shabbos? Remember this case? Imagine for a moment, I'm standing in a Rishos Harabim. Right? And what a public domain, right? So and imagine I throw an object. The object travels from Rishos Harabim through Rishos Hayachid and lands in another Rishos Harabim. So I will say, the shaila is, am I liable for hotzah, for transferring an item from one domain to another on Shabbos? You see, what's interesting about this case is what? What's interesting about this case is the item began in Rosh Hashanah and it ended in Rosh Hashanah. Did it come to rest in a Rosh Hashanah in the private domain? Did it come to rest? Not technically, no. So I will say, this is a case, this is a machlokes in Rabbi and Nechama. Rabbi says, the Chachamim say, you're pater. Since the object never came to rest in Rosh Hashanah, this is not a case of hotzah. Rebbe says you're chayiv. Why? Rebbe has this concept of kluta k'misha hun chadami. Literal translation, kluta, kalot means something has been absorbed in the airspace. K'misha huncha. It's as if it has come to rest. You see, in Rebbe's Malal Abosai, since the object traveled through the airspace of the Rosh Hashanah, so it's considered to be as if it has come to rest inside that domain as well. So the Gemara says over here, Rabbi Abba says to Ula, whose opinion does our Mishnah reflect? So our Mishnah reflects the view of Rebbe. Why? Because we will say, what did the Mishnah say? Husband is standing on the rooftop. What does he do? He takes the get, he throws it. The Mishnah said, once it leaves the domain of the roof, then what? She's divorced. Why? Because now it's in the airspace, ultimately again of the chutzner, of her domain, and therefore kluta k'mishahuncha. Let's finish. She says, could even be reflective of the view of the Rabbanon. How so? Ad kanlo pligi Rabbanon le Rabbi el inyan Shabbos. I'll say the Rabbanon only argue on Rabbi when it comes to Shabbos, hilchos Shabbos. Aval hocha mishum in turehu. We'll say here, interesting enough, by Gittin, we'll say, what are we looking for? Remember again, by Gittin, everyone is agreeing that airspace is going to acquire. As long as it's what kind of airspace? Secured, guarded, right? Everything goes back to Mishtameres, right? As long as it is guarded airspace. So Vaha, kamintar, and in this case, especially if we're dealing with a case ultimately where the exterior walls are higher than the rooftop itself, everyone agrees the airspace is guarded. So maybe even the Rabbanon, who by Shabbos hold that airspace is not as if the item has come to rest, would agree by Gittin, once it enters into her airspace, we're good to go. So again, I will say everyone is buying into this same explanation of the second case of the Mishnah. We're talking about a situation where the exterior walls are higher than the rooftop itself. Amrli Rabbi Zera Rabbi Asi, Kiman Kirebi. Whose opinion does this reflect? It reflects the view of Rabbi Damar Kluta Kamisha Hun Chadamya. Because Rabbi holds again about that when something travels through airspace, it's as if it has come to rest. Amrli Afilu Tim Rabbanon can even be reflective of the view of the Rabbanon. How so? Ad Kanlo Pligi Rabbanon Ale Rabbi El in Shabbos. Aval ha'chamishum in turihu v'ha kaminter. We'll say same answer as we gave before. It's interestingly enough. So we'll say therefore again. So we've now framed the first two cases. Case number one is she standing on the roof, he's standing in the courtyard. The Mishnah says he throws her the get. As soon as the get ultimately reaches the airspace of the rooftop, halacha l'maisa, again she is divorced. Two interpretations of that case: either the rooftop is fenced in, and therefore, again, it's a guarded area, or it's lavud. Case two, he's standing on the roof, she's standing in the courtyard. So the Mishnah says once the get leaves the airspace of the roof, she's divorced. How do we set up the case? of where the exterior walls of the courtyard are higher than the actual rooftop itself. Therefore, once the get leaves the domain of the rooftop, it's contained within those interior walls. And we'll say, and what's the chap? The airspace acquires the get for her. And I will say that Gemara wants to suggest is both according to Rebbe and the Rabbanon. Even though the Rabbanon disagree when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, they don't accept the principle of Kluta Kamisha Huncha. They will accept that principle when it comes to Gittin, because here the only thing we need is guarded airspace, and that's accomplished through the high exterior walls. Incredible. I was thinking about this a little bit. This concept of Kluta Kamisha Huncha. Right, so again, remember, Rebbe's position, literal translation, when something flies through the airspace of somewhere, it's as if it's come to rest. So let's say, what's the tension over here? The Rabbanon will say, something is only at rest if what? If it's at rest. It's got to stop. Rebbe will say that even if something passes through, it's as if it's come to rest. Well, I was thinking about this concept. I don't know why this struck me yesterday. I was so taken by this concept. Because the truth is, this often happens to us, in the world of ruchnius, in the world of spirituality. That what happens, I want to grow, right? I want to accomplish things. And what happens is kind of like, I start on something, and I never really get grounded in it. Right? I might dabble in spiritual growth. I try this, I try that. A lot of times, I find myself passing through things, but not really grounding myself in them. And so often we think to ourselves, well, if I'm just passing through, right? I tried this. If I don't become grounded, then it doesn't really mean anything. And I'll say, there's nothing further from the truth. Whenever a Jew makes an attempt at spiritual growth, even if I don't end up grounded in something, but I kind of just fly through. I was saying, my desk at home is filled with Svarim that I have started to learn. And every single sefer starts the same. Okay, this is so important. I need to do this. You know what? Just 5 minutes a day. I have 5 minutes. Everybody has 5 minutes, right? I mean, just 5 minutes a day. I'm gonna do this, right? And all good things and literal. So they're piled on my desk. And my wife says, why don't you just put them away? And I realize I can't put it away because putting it away is an admission of defeat. Right? If I put it away, that means I'm closing the door on this. So literally, it's a stack of sarm that I promised myself just 5 minutes a day. And I realized, even having the stack is, I'm not going to say it's an accomplishment, but it's a shtick accomplishment, right? It's a little bit. Why? Because I was like, those are kluta svarim. Right? So again, I tried. Most of them, I can honestly say, I did open up. Not for 5 minutes, but I did open up. I would say, whenever you try to grow in life and you try to do something, even if you don't end up settled in it and you don't do it, the act of trying to grow, the act of flying through growth, even if you don't come to rest in that endeavor, it's meaningful also. We paskin like Rebbe, at least hashkafa l'maisa, kluta kamisha huncha. Never be afraid to try something because you think you're not going to be able to sustain it. Because at the end of the day, even just flying through some level of spiritual growth, kluta kamisha huncha ultimately embeds you in a greater framework of growth as well. Incredible yisod. The Gemara goes weiter. I don't know if it's true, but it made me feel much better yesterday, at least for a little bit of time. Gemara goes weiter. Nilchak. So let's remember again. The Mishnah said that Allah l'maisa, if the get is erased, ultimately, again, I will say this was interesting. Remember, once the get arrives in her airspace, in either of the two cases, so in case number one, the airspace of the rooftop, in case number two, the airspace of the chotzer, even if she never actually receives that get in her hand, and even more than that, even if something happens to the get is erased, the get is burnt up, halacha l'maisa, she's divorced, right? Because once it's entered into secure airspace, it is as if it has entered into her hand. So Amrav Nachman, Amra Abaravua, Lo Shanu Ela Shenimchak Derech Yirida. Ultimately, I will say, this is only true if the get was erased as it was coming down in its descent. Aval nimchak derech aliyah, but Rabbi say if the get was erased in its upward trajectory. Lo, she's not divorced. My time, what's the reason? Rabbi say it was never destined to come to rest in a complete form. In other words, in order for a get to be valid, so we'll say what we're adding on over here is not only is it enough for it to be in secure airspace, it has to be on the descent, right? On the descent, right? If it's erased on the ascent, then ultimately, again, it is an invalid get because it was never roi. It was never fit to come to rest. Incredible. Nisraf, get was incinerated. So once again, the same idea, right? So just imagine, he's standing on the rooftop, he throws her the get, right? So the Mishnah said, once it leaves the rishus of the gag of the rooftop, ultimately, again, she is divorced. Even if it's burnt, falls into a fire before it reaches her hand. So Nachman qualifies this. He says, "Lo shano ela shekidem get ledleika." That's only true if he threw the get before the fire started. Aval kidma deleika leget. But if the fire was there before he threw the get, lo, she's not divorced. My taima meikar l'sreifa kazil. That get was destined for destruction. So I will say this is very important. That what you begin to see is you could have cases where as long as the get reached secure airspace, right, and was subsequently destroyed, she's divorced. But that's only if what? That's only if halacha l'maisa, the get had some possibility of getting to her hand. If this get from the beginning was destined for destruction, then halacha l'maisa, it's not going to be effective. So if on the ascent of the get already again, it's blown away, not going to work. It has to be on the descent. If that fire was raging before he ever threw the get, then halacha l'maisa, again, it had no chance of ever reaching her hand. The get is not going to be valid. Amrav Chista, Rushuyos Chalukos begin. So I will say, this is a very interesting idea over here. Chista says, domains are separate for gin. I will say, what does this mean? So Rashi points out over here as follows. Rashi says, when Reuven is divorcing Rachel, and Reuven lends Rachel space in which to receive her get. In other words, we'll say, let's say Reuven just wants to be able to throw the get to Rachel and be done. The problem is Rachel doesn't have a chatzar. So what does Reuven do? He lends her a chatzar. You can do that, right? He lends her a chatzar, says, here, this is your chatzar. So I will say, so listen to this. When a person lends property to another, or at least by Gittin, when a person lends property to another, we assume that the property that was lent is the specific property that Reuven had in mind, and he doesn't have in mind for other properties. For example, let's say Reuven goes ahead and lends her a courtyard, a chaser, and then it turns out she's standing on a rooftop, and he throws her the get on the rooftop. So we don't say, Reuven wasn't really particular which area he was lending her. He just lends her an area, and wherever she's situated, that's fine. So the Gemara says, no, that's not true. Reshuyos chalukos begittin means we'll say domains are separate by gittin, which effectively means that halacha l'maisa, if he lends her a specific area, that's the area that's hers, to the exclusion of anything else that belongs to him. Where does Saba, where does grandfather, this was a term of covet. Where does Saba, right? Where does grandfather know this concept from? Amalei mas nisinhi. It's a Mishnah. The Gemara says, if ultimately, again, she was standing on the rooftop, right? And he threw her the get. Once the get arrives in the airspace of the rooftop, she's migureshes. My asking about say, what's the case? Sheleima begag dida v'chatzar dida. If we're talking about a case of where it's her chatzar and it's her roof, then lamali aver gag. They will say, why does the get have to arrive in the airspace of the roof? If it's her chatzar, then what could the husband do? Just put the get right down there. Ela begag didei v'chatzar didei. So it must be talking about a case of where it's his roof and his chatzar. So ki yegil aver agag ma'havi. If that's the case, ultimately, again, if it's his chatzar and his rooftop, then Allah Chomais, if it gets to the airspace of the rooftop, why is she divorced? Ela pshita begag dida v'chatzar didei. It must be talking about a case of where it's her roof and his chatzar. Well, here's the problem. Ema Seifa. Look at the end of the Mishnah. Hu milamala v'hi milamata. What happens if halacha l'maisa he is on the roof, and she's in the chatzar. V'zarkulai throws her the get. Kevan shiyatzer mershos hagad. Once the get leaves the domain of the rooftop, nimchak o nisraf. Even if the get is divorced or the get is incinerated, harizim migureshes. She's divorced. But if we're talking about a case of where the roof is hers and the chatzar is his, why is she divorced? Ella, rather it has to be begag didei the chatzar dida, where it's his roof and her chatzar, to which the Gemara says, so you're telling me, Reisha begag dida, the chatzar didei. So therefore the first part of the Mishnah is talking about a case of where it's her roof, his chatzar. The Seifa, begag didei v'chatzar dida. And the Seifa is talking about a case of where it's his roof and her chatzar. So we'll say, so ideally we don't like that. In other words, in general, we like, in Mishnayos, we like to have a degree of Mishnaic symmetry, where the Mishnah is dealing with the same cases in both Reisha and Seifa. So to set it up as two different cases, Reisha and Seifa, is not ideal. The Gemara says, Elalav d'ushla makom. Rather, we'll say the way to interpret the Mishnah is, we're talking about a case where all the property in question is owned by the husband. And what is he doing? He's lending her an area in which to receive her get. And what do you see from here? Rather, you see from here that what? When people lend space, people lend one area, they don't lend two areas. And therefore, I will say, this backs up Rav Chista's statement of Reshuyos Chalukos Begittin. That when it comes to Gittin, I will say again, if an area is lent, if a husband lends a wife area, he's lending her one specific area, not whatever area she wants to use. To which the Gemara says, "Amalei midi area, dilma hakidisa v'hakidisa." I don't understand why do you have to do that? Why not just say that both the Reisha and the Seifa of the Mishnah are dealing with two separate cases? Reisha begag didei dida v'chatzar didei. The Reisha is talking about again where it's her roof, his chatzar. Seifa begag didei v'chatzar dida. The Seifa is talking about again his roof, her chatzar. I understand. Well, what's wrong with setting it up that way? I would say, so therefore, again, two different ways to interpret the Mishnah. Either, again, possibility number one is the entire Mishnah is talking about it's all his property, and in the Reisha and the Seifa, he is just lending her different spaces, and this is coming to highlight the concept of Reshuyos Chalukos Begin. Namely, that halacha l'maisa, when husband lends, and we'll say this is very important, when husband lends wife an area to be makabel to get, he's lending her one specific area. And it's not fluid, one specific area. Second possibility is that no, Reisha and Seifa are talking about two different cases. One case is talking about where she owns the roof, he owns the chatzar. Second case is talking about where he owns the roof and she owns the chatzar. Fine. Amar Rava, shalosh midos begin. There are three different cases. Rashi says over here, shalosh midos begin, chalukos midin shari surin. There are three ways in which the halachos of Gittin are different than any other case of Isser. So we'll say, so number one, so had the Amar Rabbi Kluta Kamishun Chadam, Upligi Rabbanon Alei, Haimi Linyin Shabbos, Aval Hach Mishum in Turehu Vahaminter. So we'll say number one is in Hilcho Shabbos is a machlokes between Rabbi and the Rabbanon, as we just said before, about Kluta Kamishun. That machlokes is only by Shabbos. When it comes to Gittin, everyone agrees that as long as it is secure airspace, then what? The airspace has the ability to acquire it on behalf of the woman, and it's as if the get has come to rest. See, even the Rabbanon, who disagree by Shabbos, will agree that by Gittin, secure airspace acquires. That's distinction number one. Distinction two, V'hadam Rav Chista, Na'atz Chanabirsha Sayachab Rosha Traskol, V'zarak V'nach Al Gabav, Afilu Gavoa Mea Amachayiv, L'fi Shirshus Hayochid Ola Ad L'Rakia. Supposed to listen to this. So the Gemara says, "Hanimil in Shabbos." Now watch this case. We'll say if I'm standing in Rishus Harabim, and I go ahead and there is a pole, right? And ultimately, again, on the top of that pole is a basket. If I go ahead and I throw an object from Rishus Harabim into and it lands on that very tall basket, what's the halacha? I'm chayiv, because that basket represents a Rishus Hayachid. Rishus Hayachid. And Rosh Hashanah is Ola Ad L'Rakia. That concept only works by Gittin. Hanami Linyan Gittin. For Shabbos, Aval Hacha Mishum Turihu V'Halo Mintar. But I will say, for example, let's say that pole belongs to Rachel, right? And Reuven, the husband, takes the get, throws it into that very tall pole, right? And it lands on the basket on top. She will not be divorced. Why will she not be divorced? I will say, why? Because Halacha L'Maisa, for Gittin, what do you need? Guarded and secure airspace. That's not called guarded and secure. We'll say, what's the definition of guarded and secure? That she has access to it. In this case, because she doesn't have access to the get, therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not going to work. So that's distinction number 2. We'll say, Amud Beis, Ayin Tes Amud Beis 79b. V'hadam Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, lo ya'amod adam begag zeh, v'yiklot me'gishamim migago shel chavero. Well, it's a third distinction. It's actually interesting. All of these things are 3 distinctions between Gittin and Shabbos. Third distinction, say listen to this, is Rabbi Yehuda said name of Shmuel, a person shouldn't stand on one rooftop and collect rainwater from another rooftop. Now we'll say why? Why? He says, first of all, if you look at Rashi says, V'hadam Rabbi Yehuda, 79b, first Rashi, V'hadam Rabbi Yehuda, lo yamor adam al gag, v'yiklot me'gishamim. Rashi says, Hatzafin al gago shel chavero, davi motzi mirishus l'rishus, im lo ervu. She'afa pi she'inam darim ala gagos, shayach nami buhu isur chilik rishus. So we'll say, let's just talk about this just for a second on the outside. Remember, we'll say on a strict halachic level, hotzah, transferring an item from one domain to another, really only applies from what? From a rishus harabim to a rishus hayachid to rishus harabim, or dalit amis in rishus harabim itself. What doesn't it apply to? It doesn't apply technically from one rishus hayachid to another rishus hayachid. So we'll say, in other words, on a technical level, there is no problem with transferring an item from one private domain to another private domain. Right? That's the halacha. Chazal came along and said, you cannot transfer an item from one private domain to another private domain without what? Without an eruv chatzeros. So here we're dealing with the following case. Imagine for a moment, Reuven and Shimon are next door neighbors. I will say, imagine for a second that they have connected rooftops. Get rooftops. You could have this, like let's imagine you have like a semi-detached home, right? So the homes, you have separate domiciles, but a shared roof. So the halacha is, imagine for a moment that Reuven is on the rooftop. So the halacha is that Reuven cannot gather rainwater, from Shimon's rooftop, unless, of course, halacha l'maisa, they have an eruv chatzeros. Why? Because again, now let's read it inside. Lo yamor adam begagzeh. Person, right? Reuven shouldn't stand on one roof. V'yilkol me'yishar megago shel chavera, and collect rainwater from Shimon's roof. Why? Shekeshim shediyur nechalukin milamata, because the same way that they are separate domiciles below, kach diyur nechalukin milamala, so too they are separate domiciles on the rooftop as well. So we'll say a very interesting idea. So they're considered to be separate domiciles on the roof, even though the rooftops are connected. Therefore, when Reuven's standing on his roof, he really can't collect rainwater from Shimon's roof. The Gemara says, Hanimili le'inyan Shabbos. That is only true when it comes to Shabbos. Aval le'inyan get mishum kpeidahu v'kuli halo kaptim Shabbos. Imagine the following situation. Imagine, right? Reuven owns a semi-detached unit. See, he owns two residences. He tells Rachel, the rooftop of residence A is yours to receive your get. Right, to receive your get. Then I will say what happens. It turns out that it lands on the rooftop of residence B. So the Rebbe says, Halach l'maisa, the Gemara says, it works. It works. Since both rooftops are owned by Reuven, a person's not makbid like that. Even though by Shabbos, the two attached roofs are considered to be two separate domains, for Gittin, they are not. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Aval beGittin hayulo shnei gagin smuchen zelazeh v'shilu makom bazeh v'kabel eskita v'kibalto bazeh lo aminan hacha rishiyos chalukos." So Rabbi say, even though an attached roof belonging to two different domiciles for Shabbos is considered to be two different domains, for Gittin it's not. Interesting. So Rabbi say, so again, halacha l'maisa. Those are the three distinctions between Hilchos Shabbos and Hilchos Gittin. Right? So number one, Kluta K'mishahuncha. Kluta K'mishahuncha is a machlokes by Shabbos, but everyone agrees it works by Gittin. Distinction number 2 is the case of the basket on top of the pole. That'll be considered to be a transference of domain for Shabbos, but by Gittin, it is not considered to be a guarded area. Distinction number 2, joined rooftops, connected rooftops, are separate, distinct areas for Hilchos Shabbos, but not for Hilchos Gittin. Incredible. Amar Abaye says, Shtei Chatzero Zu Lifnei Mizu. So we'll say, so imagine for a moment you have two courtyards, an interior courtyard and an exterior courtyard. Pnimis Shalah, V'chitzona Shalo. The interior courtyard belongs to Rachel. The exterior one belongs to Reuven. Umechitzos hachitzonos otfos ala pnimios. I will say that interestingly enough, the external courtyard has very tall walls, and the tall walls of the external courtyard are taller than the walls of the interior courtyard. So now what happens? V'zarkula, and he's now Reuven is standing in his interior courtyard, throws the get to her towards her exterior. I'm sorry, Reuven standing in his exterior courtyard, throwing the get to her in her interior courtyard. So what's the interesting case? Once the get arrives essentially in the airspace of the exterior courtyard. So in other words, almost if you can imagine, he's standing in his exterior courtyard, right? She's in her interior courtyard. The walls of the exterior courtyard are higher than the walls of the interior courtyard. Once the get arrives in the airspace of the walls of the exterior courtyard. Now what does that mean? Specifically, the area of the walls of the exterior courtyard that are higher than the walls of the interior courtyard, ultimately migureshes. She is divorced. So it's like you can imagine, he's throwing the get, if you can imagine, like at an arc, right? So now you can have a case where the get is in the airspace of the walls of the exterior courtyard, taller than the walls of the interior courtyard. She's divorced. What's the logic? My taima, penimis guf mechitzis b'mechitzos hachitzon mintera. So it's very interesting because we view the interior courtyard as also being guarded by the walls of the exterior courtyard. So even though the walls are situated around the exterior courtyard, they're considered to be servicing the interior courtyard as well. Interesting. Masha'inki bekupos. This is different than the case of baskets. What's the case of baskets? Here we go. Shtei kupos, zu besoch zu. So imagine you have two boxes, one inside the other. Penimis shalom v'chitzon shalo. The outer box is his, and the inner box is hers. V'zarkula, and he throws her a get. Afilu gia la'aver penimis in the migureshes. Even if the get arrives in the airspace of her interior box, ultimately she's not divorced. What's the reason? My taima daha lo nach. So here's the difference. Boxes, kalim, do not acquire through airspace. How do utensils acquire? Ultimately by the item coming to rest. So therefore, he threw her the get. The get is in the airspace of her kli, of her interior kli. It doesn't, in order to say it doesn't work. She's not divorced. She's only divorced if the get arrives or comes to rest in her kli. One second. V'chi nach my hobby. Kelev shalakach b'rishos mocher. Both says, goes back to yesterday's daf. No, we'll say, how are we setting up this case? Where is her kli? Her kli is situated in his kli. Because remember again, we're talking about a case of a box, right? He has a big outer box. She has a smaller inner box. So now we're saying, okay, he throws her the get. Okay, so if the get enters the airspace of her inner kli, she's not going to be divorced. That's not a chiddush. Kalim don't have airspace. So we'll say, I want to just tell you, the only case of a kli that has to do with airspace is a unique halacha by a kli cheres, right? An earthenware vessel could become tameh through its airspace, right? If you dangle a sheretz inside the airspace of an earthenware utensil, becomes tameh. I'll say, but that is a unique chiddush. In general, kalim do not have airspace. Now you're telling me he throws a get. So if it's in the airspace of her interior kli, it doesn't work. But if it comes to rest in her interior kli, it does work. Why should that work? I will say this is kelev shalokeach b'rishos mocher. Remember, you spoke on this case. Kelev shalokeach b'rishos mocher means the utensils of the purchaser situated in the domain of the buyer. That's a machlokes if that works. If her kli is sitting in his kli, why should her kli acquire at all? To which one says, no, hagamayaskinon bekupa she'en la shulayu. It's interesting. I will say, what's the case? We're talking about where his kli doesn't have a bottom. right? His kli doesn't have a bottom. So if you could imagine, again, he has a kli, which essentially is not really much of a kli. It's kind of just like walls, right? He has kli, it's sitting down on the ground. Her kli is situated in that as well, right? But there's no bottom to his kli. So therefore, because there's no bottom to his kli, it is not a case of kelev shalokeach b'rishus mocher. Incredible. Mishnah. Beis Shammai omrim polta adam ishto beget yashan or Beis Hillel osrim. Beis Shammai says you could use a get yashan to affect divorce. Beis Hillel says no, you can't. Gemara says, what is a get yashan? Ve'izu get yashan. What is a get yashan? Kol shnis yachid ima me'achar shekasvula. Both say a get yashan is a get, is any get where after it's been written, husband has been alone with his wife. So we'll say, if you can imagine, again, so Reuven goes ahead and writes a get for Rachel, and then after having written a get for Rachel, what does he do? He has zichud with her. He's alone with her. That's called the get yashan. Beis Shammai says you can't affect divorce with such a get. Beis Shammai says you can affect divorce with such a get. Beis Hillel says you cannot. What's going on over here? So what are they arguing about? Here we go. Beis Shammai Samri lo amrinan gzera shem yomru gita kodim libna ubeis Hillel Samri amrinan gzera shem yomru gita kodim libna. So we'll say this is very interesting. So what do we consider out of here? So let's imagine the following case. Imagine what's today. What's today? The 12th of Av. No, what am I sorry? 16th of Av. Yes, it was 2 Av, right? 16th of Av. So let's imagine the following situation. Imagine, Imagine Reuven writes a get on 2 B'Av. And I will say, this is what happens when you don't pay attention in Shir, right? He thought he heard 2 B'Av is a big day for marriages. He thought a big day to end marriages. It's a big day to make marriages. Okay, mistakes happen. Right, so what happens? See, he writes a get on 2 B'Av. He writes a get on the 15th of Av. Fine. Now we'll say, what happens afterwards? He's alone with Rachel. He's alone with Rachel. Right? Reuven is alone with Rachel. And I will say, and what happens? So, and apparently, Baruch Hashem, they try to patch things up. Their time together resulted in intimacy. And ultimately, again, she becomes pregnant. Subsequently, they still decide it's not going to work. He gives her the get. So I will say, so now here's something very interesting over here. The problem we're going to have is, and let's say again, let's not make this about days. Let's say a month later, they decide to get divorced. So I'll say, so now what's the issue? Rachel has a get that is dated 2 B'Av. I will say, now the issue at hand over here is that when people kind of go look back, it's going to, if you do the math, it looks like she was divorced before she became pregnant. Right? Now, what does that mean? She's had a child out of wedlock. Now we'll say, what's the halachic status of a child born out of wedlock? No, totally fine. Remember again, child born out of wedlock, but again, it looks weird, right? It's not good. So Beis Shammai says, nah, don't worry about it. No one is doing the math like that. The get is a valid get. Let them go ahead and get divorced. Beis Hillel says, no, we're really concerned that there's going to be a cloud of suspicion around this child, that people are going to think that the child was ultimately born out of wedlock. And they'll say, that's the machlokes. So that's the case of get yashan. Beis Shammai says it works. Beis Hillel says it does not work. So both say, we pass like Beis Hillel, and one should not get divorced with a get yashan. Now the Gemara says, but what happens if you used it? So you shouldn't use it. What happens if you did use it? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Shmuel, im nises lo teisei. So you shouldn't use it, but ultimately, again, if you used it, halacha l'maisa, you don't have to leave the second marriage. So she shouldn't use it, but if it was used, it's fine. V'ikadami, others say, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Shmuel, im nisgarsha tinaseh lechatchila. So others say, I will say that, no, you shouldn't, maybe it's ideal not to utilize it, but ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, if it's the get that you have, then it can be used even lechatchila. So Rabbi says, so stop over here for today, but bottom line, halacha l'maisa, a get yashan should not be used in accordance with Beis Hillel, but halacha l'maisa, if it was used to effect divorce, absolutely legitimate, absolutely kosher. Rabbi say, shkoyach.
Consolation, we were talking about the books piled